into these categories, otherwise you're not compliant. Or the agency can say themselves, we are low on veteran-owned companies, and we have this requirement that comes out, and we're going to just set aside for veteran-owned companies. And that business, that requirement, that RFP, can only be bid on by veteran-owned companies. So we said yesterday, the more certifications you have, the better. That's why. Because if you're a women-owned, veteran-owned, veteran service disabled, if you have all three of those certifications, that means any contract that comes out with any of those three designations, you can go after, that it's a set-aside contract and you can go after it. Whereas if you didn't have women-owned, you wouldn't be able to go after that women-owned particular part of the contract. And again, the only requirement is that whatever the designation is, you have 51% of the contract, and then you can subcontract to somebody else, which is why you see these crazy things where you have a 3-person small business veteran service disabled company with IBM behind them, right? How did that ever happen? Well, it's obviously too big of a requirement for just the small company. They need some additional resources, that's why. And as long as the small business gets 51% and IBM gets 49%, you're good to go. And then you can also be a GSA schedule holder. So that was one of the government-wide access contracts we talked about yesterday, where you go through a separate process, an RFP, a proposal, you submit your stuff, and then once you're awarded a GSA schedule, you can work directly with the government. You're in a prime contract relationship at that point through your GSA schedule. You can also team up with other GSA schedule holders and go into it together. So that gives you another option. So that's one of your decisions to make as to how you want to approach this process. What we're going to talk about for the rest of the class is applies to all these things. So, you know, if you're the prime, you have responsibility for everything. But if you're a sub, you still have to do all the things that we're talking about.
I guess I have a question between the top two, the prime contractor.
Uh-huh.
I understand like on the RFP, it's going to spell out what you have to do on that, if it's women-owned, veteran-owned.
Mm-hmm.
So I know you'd have to probably use some contractors. Is there ever RFPs that come in to be a contractor, they say you can be a regular contractor, but you have to use so many subs of the women-owned, things like that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Would you mind if we talked about that? Because we have a whole section on this
Yep,
afternoon.
that will work.
But the answer to your question is, I don't know what keeps stinging. I don't know if it's...
Maybe is there volume on that? So it might be how that mouse is being held.
It might be the mouse. Instead of using, I mean, if you
Maybe it's
feel comfortable with the clicker, it won't probably ding you as much as the mouse will.
Okay.
So here's where you can be a GSA schedule holder working with a teaming partner, or you can work on those set-asides that we talked about yesterday. Just want to talk about some of the things so that you understand how your clients are different. So yesterday we talked about the difference between commercial customers and federal government, sort of the overall marketplaces. Let's talk a little bit about the clients. So the government is driven by the FAR. So we're going to spend time talking about the clauses in the FAR. It's not going to be an exciting lecture, but we will get through it. But my point in telling you is that the government has worked hard to, even though the laws mainly benefit one side of the house, they're not unduly restrictive of what you're doing, because they need you. So they're not going to try to put all these regulations in effect that are going to cause you not to want to play. So as we go through the clauses, you need to sort of appreciate the fact that you really can't negotiate a lot with these FAR clauses. I mean, some of them you have a little bit more flexibility. The government actually takes this very, very seriously. So Office of Federal Procurement Policy, a little while ago, probably about 2 years, put together a document where they said, hey, we see contracting officers all the time. And some contracting officers are really, they work really well with contractors. And others are like really risk adverse, and so they don't work as well with contractors. So they were trying to tell government officials, hey, we've got your back. we know you're trying to get business done with business people, so, you can be a little bit flexible when it comes to certain things, and here are the things you can be flexible with. And then they also looked at us, contractors, and they said, you're making assumptions about the government that aren't necessarily accurate either. So there are things that you can do, and they started telling us about that. They were called Mythbusters memos. So if you look up Office of Federal Procurement Policy and Mythbusters, you'll see these two memos that came out. So the government is really trying hard to make it as easy as possible to work with the government. But I want you to know what battles to fight. If you try to get the government to change a FAR requirement, you're probably not going to be highly successful. But, other terms and conditions, you have some wiggle room to negotiate. So just understand, pick your battles. When they issue an RFP and you respond with a proposal, their assumption is that you have accepted everything in that RFP. So each of those FAR clauses that are only one line designated, the number, the title, and the date we talked about yesterday, you're expected to go and read those and make sure that you're agreeing to step up to those things. Now, thousands of contractors have gone before you and stepped up to those things. So, for example, I just came back from China, so this is forefront in my mind. There's a requirement on the GSA schedule that if you go to conferences for the federal government, you don't give out Chinese tchotchke. Those little tchotchke things. Is that a term you use? Like the giveaways at conferences, the bags or the... Right, the bling. That you don't use Chinese-based companies. So, it's just something that the government wants to enforce, right? So, it's those kind of things where you just need to make different business decisions if you want to play in the government space. We talked about regulations. It does open your organization up to audits that you wouldn't have on the prime contractor side. Typically, profit margins are in the 3 to 15% range. In a firm fixed price, you agree to set up the contract for a certain price, but if you put some economies of scale or efficiencies in, you can get a greater profit margin for that. But typically, 10% is about what the government marketplace is. They do pay their bills. When you submit, when you get an acceptance document and you invoice them, they have 30 days to pay you. And as long as it's a properly filled out invoice. And then if they don't pay you within 30 days, they give you interest. So, that's something you don't typically see with commercial customers. They have very structured requirements document and a procurement process. So once you sort of get your head into this mindset of sections A through M, and you read a couple RFPs, because your RFPs are going to look similar, because a lot of times, just like we would do, you cut and paste from documents that already work, so once you start seeing, you'll see the same requirements over and over again. It becomes a very formalized process, and you always know what to expect with the government, because the government has been buying things for so long, they're really good at procurement. So when you get that RFP document, you pretty much know everything you need to do on this contract. Whereas, as opposed to if you enter into a commercial contract, the RFP document's only going to be as good as the persons you're dealing with. Whereas they have a lot of institutional knowledge here that they've been using for years. Your government business does impact other business decisions. There are things that you do for the government that could prompt you to get into new business lines in your commercial business. Look at Boeing. Came up with all the fighter jets, took some of that same technology and put it into their commercial practices, particularly the small seat situation, right? On the commercial side, it's governed by the UCC, the Uniform Commercial Code. It's competition driven. So I make it sound like it's the government is competitive too, but it's competition is a component of things. Sometimes they're looking for best value. Sometimes they're looking for the lowest cost. Sometimes they're looking for meeting their socioeconomic goals. So for the government, it's just not about competition, it's about a broader, try to make society better kind of thing. In your commercial side, you don't really have any audit, like IBM can't say, let me see your books, or let me see how you've come up with these prices. They're not going to do any of that. On the commercial side, there's no profit limits. But on the same token, your commercial companies may go out of business, right? They could not be there tomorrow and then not pay you. You know, depending on who you're working with, companies are getting better about a structured procurement process and structured requirements process. Some of them are there, some of them aren't. And you can run your commercial business as a standalone. So you could have just your commercial business or your federal business or a combination of the two.
Good question.
Sure.
Can subs have subs?
Yes. Unless the contract specifically says you can't. So when we start thinking about getting our head around getting into the federal government business, sort of the things you need to think about are cost pools and rate development. So if you're going to be providing services on your contract, you need to think about what labor rates you're going to use for different people in your company. So, you know, if you're going to have a program manager, what's the rate you're going to charge for that person? You know, if you have a systems engineer or manufacturing production manager, what is the rate you're going to charge for each of those people? Cost pools, the government accepts the fact that you have a let's say, for example, you have a production line manager, and you charge, you pay that person, say, $75 an hour. So this is their salary. Is that what you're going to charge the government? Is that what you're going to charge your commercial companies for that person?
No.
No. What are you going to do?
At least 50% more than I thought it would have
Okay, 50% more double, what are you basing that on? Like what?
been. Well, if you got his salary, you got all the taxes and all the benefits, blah, 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 you got
Right.
to pay that. Plus, you got to make a little bit on him just
Right.
because.
Right. So you're going to do some form of overhead, right? And you're going to add a certain amount to that. So let's say you had $10 for that. You're also going to do something called G&A, General Administrative. Like you're going to want to make sure that your marketing, your advertising, all that stuff, your corporate attorneys, that parts of their salary are going to get charged back to this person. And then, as you said, you're going to want some form of profit. Okay, so let's say that it ends up being this, and you end up with a $100 rate. This is the price that you're going to give to the government for this production manager. So you were saying it might be closer to double this, whatever your numbers end up being here. So the government understands that you're going to pay a salary to the person, and then you're going to have some amount of expenses that are in your overhead, and a certain amount of expenses that are in your G&A, and that you're going to expect a profit out of this. What the government will look at is what goes into your overhead, what specific costs go into your overhead, and what specific costs go into your G&A. And they don't care where a cost goes. So they don't care if you put your CEO's, part of your CEO's salary in overhead or part of it in G&A. But what they do care about is if you put it in overhead initially, it stays in overhead. Or if you put it in G&A, it stays in overhead. In other words, they don't want you every month to be floating expenses back and forth between these two categories. Why?
They can't follow it.
Right, exactly, they can't follow it. So this is, when we talk about cost pools, we're talking about these kind of things, like what you put in overhead, what you put in G&A. And the government has 3 criteria for appropriate rates. So when they look at what gets built up in each of these, they're looking at 3 things. And we'll talk more about this later, but just to sort of foreshadow it. They look at reasonableness, allocability, and allowability. So reasonableness, allocability, allowability. So, who's got a pen? Okay. If I sell this pencil to the government and I charge the government $1.25 for it, is that a reasonable expense? But, okay, but basically, do we all agree that $1.25 is a reasonable expense? Now, let's say, thank you. Let's say, for example, instead, I bought everybody who's working on the government contract a Mont Blanc $125 pen. Is that a reasonable expense? What made you decide that $1.25 was reasonable and $125 wasn't?
Common sense.
You're exactly, but it's the like you're prudent business people, right? That's the term. You're a prudent business person, so you know that giving everybody a $1.25 pencil or pen would be a reasonable expense, but $125 that's too much. So whatever that line in the sand was in your head that said reasonable, unreasonable, that's what the government uses to determine reasonableness. You know, would a prudent business person think that that was a reasonable expense? Everybody good on reasonable? Next I want to talk about allowability. So when I am a contractor and I work for an hour and I charge the government my hourly rate, is that allowable? Right? We've already negotiated the rate. I've worked an hour. I'm not getting paid. That's perfectly allowable. If I have to buy a cable, the government wants to have a working computer system, and I buy a cable to make this computer run, is that an allowable expense? Yeah. Okay, if I go out to lunch today, and I'm a scotch drinker, so I would love a scotch, is that an allowable expense? No, because the government says alcohol is not an allowable expense. So the government has certain things listed in the FAR under what they call the cost accounting standards that tell you whether certain expenses are allowable or not allowable. So now I have a trick question for you. Let's say, for example, you win a GSA schedule or you win a contract. And when you win the contract, basically all you win is a fishing license. You have to actually go out and write proposals to win follow-on business. When you write those proposals, is that cost allowable or unallowable?
Unallowable?
I'm sorry?
Is that unallowable?
Anybody have a different answer?
Allowable.
So the answer is, it depends. It depends on the contract. If the contract says it's allowable, it's allowable. If the contract says it's unallowable, it's unallowable. I've worked on contracts under both scenarios. So some allowable items are contract driven. So that's what you need to know about allowability. Allocability, let's say we're going to split the room right down the middle, about the light of my eye, right down the middle, and half of us are working on government business, and half of us are working on commercial business. We have lights. Who are the lights benefiting? The commercial company, commercial business, or the federal business? Both, right? So how would the government expect the cost of these lights to be allocated between our government business and our commercial business? 50-50. But can you see where some slimy contractors might try to say, I'm going to put 95% of the lights to my federal government business so they can charge less to my commercial customers, or vice versa? That's what the government's looking at when it comes to allocability, that you're allocating your cost according to your business case. So these are the standards that the government's using for that. We'll talk more about that later. Another thing that the government looks at is your cost estimating system. Now, if you're a small business, you don't have to have this yet, but it's something that's worthwhile for you to be thinking about. So if I'm the government and I come to you and I say, I understand you're painters, and I would like this room painted, and here are the dimensions of the room. I would expect to give you the dimensions of the room, and I would expect you to put it into your cost estimating system, and tell me how much it's gonna cost to do this road. Because if you talk to most painters, they have a per square foot